Awesome. I think our guest today reps one of the most genuine ethos that I've come across. As a four-time founder over 18 grueling years, he has plenty of dirt and grit to share from his journey. After the sale of his fourth business last year, and while he currently interviews co-founders for business number 5, he's been helping other founders understand the human side of business that most people just tend to neglect, including himself at his first company, which is what he's here to talk about with us today. So without further ado, Tobias Günther. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry.
That's fine for me. And let's not cut
All right,
this
we're
out.
gonna
It's
cut this.
wonderful. Yeah.
Without further ado, Tobias Günther, welcome to the dirt.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Jim. That's something to live up to, and I'm very curious about our conversation. Thanks for having me.
Oh, well, you've given me plenty to look up to, so glad I could give you a little something as well. I mean, you've done some really awesome stuff. Am I just like starting with the basics? 4 companies, long journey, right? 18 years plus. Talk to me a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, sure. I started out almost 20 years ago now, building a service business. So a pretty simple business. I started on my own and then worked on company websites, a classic web agency, if you will, and started to grow that into a bigger and bigger company. And in the end, we were still a small company, 10 people, but we had top clients in Germany mostly, and a lot of fun. But I think that's the first interesting point in my career or in my path. I'm sometimes a slow learner, if you will, because it took me 8 years or 6 years in that case to realize that client work wasn't what I wanted to do. Right? We had top clients and a good business, but it wasn't what I wanted to do. So that's the first, I think, important point in my career where I learned more about myself, you could say. And I did the second company for another 11 years. That brings us to all the way to 2021 in that case, where I sold that. That's the short version. And in those 11 years, I started another 2 companies that were not profitable, that were not successful, that failed from the start, from the get-go. So I have 4 companies, 2 horrible failures, one that was at least profitable, a service business, and the last one, or the second one, it depends on how you look at it, that was really profitable, and I was able to successfully sell that. But if we dig into that those 11 years were also not just roses and sunshine.
Yeah, yeah, the dirt, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I like that term. Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of those failures. What specifically were some of the hardest obstacles to overcome, and some of the differences between the ones that worked out and the ones that didn't?
Yeah. I think the biggest lesson that I learned, and I had to learn it twice, I said I'm a slow learner sometimes, is that if you're actively in a business, if you're operating the business, not if you're an investor so much, but if you're actively involved in a business, you need to have full focus on that business. Side projects, very tricky thing. On the one hand, wonderful. I think we have to try out new things, but really starting a business with multiple people, a complex topic, maybe a difficult market, a new product development, you can't do that just on the side. It's really hard. You have to find that point. You can do that for some time, for a limited time, but then there comes the point in time where you have to actively say yes to one thing and no to the other things. And in those 2 cases, I didn't do that. I thought I could run a 10 people business which was very demanding, difficult market, and still lots of things to do, lots of dirt on my hands, if you will.
Yeah.
And thought I could, well, somehow do another business on the side, a big one, of course, not something small. And I had to learn that over and over again. And it's so tricky because I'm a bootstrapper by nature. I refuse to take venture capital, to the advantage and the disadvantages, of course, also. But if you want to play it like that, if you want to bootstrap and do it with your own hands, then you need at least to have focus. And on the other hand, you have a cash flow problem, of course. So there has to be another side to that. And that's, I think, that the difficult thing to balance. You need some income stream to finance yourself. And on the other hand, you also need the focus. So that's a pretty difficult conundrum you have to solve there. And twice I didn't. And one time I did.
Yeah. It sounds so simple, but it's terribly complex, right? As most simple things are. The the comment that you made around venture capital, right? Oftentimes so many founders see it as this shiny object, as the path towards becoming $1 billion company, and as the dream, right? Getting venture capital money and growing into a unicorn. You mentioned that there's downsides to it as well, right? Talk to me a little bit about what you mean by that.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I notice the statement as I said it is a little bit difficult. So I think the most important thing is to know yourself, to know what kind of person are you, what kind of entrepreneur are you. And in my case, I'm incredibly stubborn. You can ask friends and co-founders, in that I want the maximum amount of freedom. I want the maximum amount of creative leeway. I want to determine what I work on, who I work with, how I work, how much I work, and not because I want to work not much. I want to work quite a lot, but I want to be able to determine that, to make those decisions myself. And I think that makes me pretty incompatible with outside funding, and not because the system is stupid, just because you are getting somebody on board who should help you build that business, right? And they should help you make some decisions and steer the ship. But in my case, I want to have full control over every little detail. And that's, I think, the problem. And it took me quite some time to understand myself in that regard. And I think if you're not that special in that regard as I am, I think venture capital can have lots of benefits and it can be wonderful. And depending on the idea you want to build, there might be no way around venture capital, right? Because you just can't do it on your own. You can't just bootstrap a huge multi-million, billion-dollar business from the ground up. But if you know yourself and if you know what you want in life and in entrepreneurship, this might not be the best path for you. And it wasn't, and it isn't for me.
Yeah. And speaking as someone who's been a part of building and growing a venture capital firm, I get that, right? At Orchid Black, we don't typically work with VC-backed companies because it's another personality at the table. It's another agenda at the table, right? And ultimately, there's got to be a decision around what that means for a founder in who they want on their team, how they're going to be able to listen, and who they want to share authority with. All great points.
Yeah. Did you see that, out of curiosity, in your work and in your network and working with founders? Do you see a personality difference, something like what I described, or is that more of a project to project difference, or do you see it also in the personality of different entrepreneurs and founders?
I think it's both.
Oh.
I mean, if there's if there isn't a solid standing of what advice you as an entrepreneur, as a founder, are going to take versus where you're going to listen and be patient listening, and then ultimately not necessarily do that, venture capital can be an entire waste of time, because
Mhm.
you need to know what to listen to, because investors are not always operators. Investors are not always right. And just like having advisors around the table, you really need to understand how to take that advice and inform an opinion rather than just go do something. And traditional VCs oftentimes are very firm and act in their advice, in their counsel,
Yeah.
that they are right. And that's just not always the case.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's got to be a strong founder that is able to take in advice, and ultimately disseminate the information in the right way.
Yeah, that's a good point. Makes it also a little bit more, even more difficult for first time founders, younger founders
Oh,
who don't
terribly.
have that experience, who have no way of deciding, is that the right kind of advice or is it not? So it makes it even more and more tricky. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really easy for people who have been lifelong investors to advise on how to operate, but when you're not exposed to it, or that was a decade or however long ago it was, things change, right? Some of the things that you talk about in culture, remote work, these are things that 10 years ago didn't have the same meaning as they do today,
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And so I'm curious, speaking kind of, is to someone who's been through this in a number of decades, like when you hear those words, culture, remote work, what does that actually mean to you? What do those terms
Yeah.
mean to you?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, good question. Especially in terms of culture, the term is so undefined, actually. Everybody understands something else when they hear that term.
Yeah.
So for me, the definition, or the best definition that I work with, is how we want to treat each other, how we want to work with each other, but also how we want to treat each other as humans. I think that is the defining aspect of culture. If you limit it to values, mission principles, and vision, which is all fine, don't get me wrong, that's all necessary and valuable. But if there's not the underlying foundation of how do we want to work with each other every day, how do we want to communicate, what kind of relationships do we want to build with each other, then I think that's pretty empty, and then it doesn't mean anything. I can remember distinctly going through all of that, and we started pretty early in that second company doing a values workshop, and it was great. We wrote together a couple of strong terms and idealistic sentences, and they all landed on a poster. And I'm pointing to the wall right next to me here, and it was sitting there, and it was, the thing is everything was right on that poster. It's everything was made total sense, but, and that's why I'm mentioning it, we didn't have the underlying skills to make that a reality. So we weren't able to communicate as deeply as we should have been. Relationship building wasn't top of mind. All of that, all of those ground rules, that groundwork wasn't being done. And that's when lofty things like values and mission principles just don't serve you. So I'm always trying to go deeper and work on the basic layer, and work on relationships and communication. That's for me is the basics, or the basis of a good culture. Everything else comes later. Yeah.
When you started your first company, or really any of them, right?
Mm.
Talk about a little, like, what changed in your mindset, right? To get you to that point around culture, because I know you probably didn't start there on day one, right? What did you go through that led you to that really deep and informed uh position?
Yeah, your hunch is absolutely right. I'm afraid to say so. So where should we start? For a very long time, managing my teams felt like a gigantic struggle. It was so exhausting. And it felt like everything depended on me. I was responsible for everything. I think that is a pretty common feeling for many entrepreneurs. Um, if you want to look at it from a different side, I'd have to admit that I was micromanaging people because I was insecure. I wasn't sure. I wasn't trusting enough. And the thing is, I was pretty sure it wasn't the fault of my team. I hired capable, clever, kind people. That was not the problem. So I knew it was somewhere in myself. And I think the big change event for me then, in addition to that realization, was a burnout. I had the full Monty, including 5 weeks of rehab. It really knocked me out. That was 2014, quite some while ago.
Mm.
And how can I say that? The signs were pretty clear that something wasn't going right, right? And what I learned in the years after that was, for one, a healthy detachment from my company, not a complete detachment, but a healthy one.
Mm.
The brutal realization that I had to change things in my life and my approach to leadership. And I read a ton of books. I attended courses. I even became a certified meditation teacher, a mindfulness teacher. That was more on the personal side, but all of that changed how I approached leadership. How I let's go back to that term that I used earlier, to how I treated people, right? And the results were pretty quickly. The team was much happier. I was able to not micromanage anymore. People were allowed to grow and take on responsibility. And the thing is, things got easier for myself. I was getting rid of a lot of the natural, or the usual drama that occurs in companies, and that felt so relieving, so good. Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean,
Uh-huh.
that's everything gets easier, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of crazy to think about, and it doesn't just apply to, tech startups either, right? It kind of just applies to general life. But
Mhm.
when you give people a problem to solve, right, and the tools to solve it, right, you can't just throw whatever you want at them. uh, it's it's really awesome to see the way that people can develop, and how much easier that gets on you, because you hired people for a reason, so let them show you why you hired them.
Yeah,
it's,
absolutely. Yeah.
it's not that
Yeah.
novel, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. That's so true. And I think the lesson for me, and then I see that in when I mentor or coach other founders, we have to take a step back and think very carefully if it's all the employee's fault. There's always, we're always in it together, of course,
Mhm.
but for that to be true, to be the employee's fault in total, I would have had to make every mistake by the book when it comes to hiring, and I don't believe that. In many cases, I think I have hired capable and clever people. So, what's my contribution there? What can I change in my approach to leadership and to dealing with situations and treating people that makes life easier for both of us? And I think that was the crucial realization for me. I make life easier for myself, and I allow other people to have more fun and to grow and to take on responsibility. That's a classic win-win.
Yeah, and forming a healthy, I'll call it detachment, right,
Mhm.
from the company is hard, and takes the right talent around you, but is so important, and it avoids things like having to break down. Or
Yeah.
in some cases, like, I know you had a situation like that where you ended up having to go to rehab. It got so bad,
Yeah.
right? Like, do you mind just talk a little bit about that, this stuff that we just don't talk about normally,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I'll go ahead, the floor is
Yeah,
yours.
yeah. My pleasure in some way. So I should lead in saying that I can't give medical advice to anybody who's listening right now, but but that out of the way, I think Yeah, it's always a mixture. I think it's rarely that there's just too much work hours. That's rarely the case. We can take a lot of work if it's fulfilling, if it's the right kind of stress, I would say, or pressure or demand, let's say it like that. But there's always something else on top. And for me, it was, and it's not always just work related. So for me, it was general health problems that had plagued me for a long time and that were growing. So that was one side of the equation. And the other side was, as I described, that I I didn't have the right perspective on leadership and on my team and how to run a company in a way that I won't be run into the ground at the same time. So I think it's always a combination. You have to really look carefully what that combination is. It's never too much. It's rarely, I shouldn't say never. It's rarely too much working hours, but it's always something else. It's problems in your partnership, maybe problems at home, problems with your co-founders, or as I said in my case, the wrong approach to leadership and entrepreneurship in general. That just couldn't work out, and things really only got better once I really took the time off. I think it's rarely that you hear at a certain point, when the stress has really built up, that you just get away with a weekend spa. You really have to unplug for a couple of weeks, mostly. Maybe even seek out therapy or other assistance.
Yeah.
So you really have to go the full way. Um, and I think, yeah, get a different perspective on things. And that takes time, of course. I think the one thing that made me a better entrepreneur, most of all, and a better human, is that I grew personally over those 18 years, that I am much more self-reflected than early in my career. And every time I hit a bump in the road, I learned something about myself, and that made the whole journey more fun for myself. It made it more fun for other people. I could better decide, this is for me, this is not for me, and that is tremendously helpful. So if this is, I'm not in a position to give advice, but the one thing I learned is, um, personal growth, self-reflection, and success as an entrepreneur are intricately connected, really closely connected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And deliberately doing all of that. Right.
Yeah.
It's culture in general, but especially remote culture just needs to be so deliberate.
Yeah.
And you had some really interesting perspectives there that you know you've had to evolve. And do you mind just talking to me a little bit about some of the work that you're doing now with other founders, creating programs that are helping to make not only the business more successful and sustainable, but also the human being on the other side, other founders taking some of what you've learned about culture and remote work and these things
Yeah.
and teaching it to others?
Yeah, sure. Pleasure. So until I have enough energy to start something new, I took on another project, and that is exactly what you describe. I help
Funny how
other
that works.
founders. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, recharge the batteries and then get on the horse again.
Yeah.
Um, help other founders build, let's say, a people first company culture, because when it comes to culture, as we've talked a little bit about it, it's so fuzzy, it's so difficult. Where do you start? And if I think back at my own path, there was a point where I knew, okay, I want to do more culture, I want to develop culture, but how the hell do I do that? If you look behind me, there's the whole library is full of those books, but none of them teaches you how to actually do it, right?
Yeah.
And especially with a topic like culture, it is so sensitive, right? It's really tricky. You don't know what happens if you touch that spot or that. Should you start here or here? Is that too early or too late? So that's what I've been working on in the last couple of months to find a repeatable process or a program with fixed modules actually that help you go that path from step 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, and 4 is at position 4 because you need 3 and 2 before of that. It doesn't work if you just do relationship work. Or I think a good example was what I said before. You can't just start with values and mission principles if people don't have a relationship with each other, if they can't communicate in a good, positive way with each other. All of that has to be built first. Or another example in that program, number 11, close to the end, is feedback. You can't start with feedback if there's no relationship, if there's no trust before that, because things will start to explode.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I want to help founders with, to build a people first culture that gives you a more resilient team on the one hand, and of course on the other hand also a more productive team. I love that these things go hand in hand. There's lots of studies. I think Harvard did a wonderful study a couple of years ago. They accompanied, I think, 200 companies, if I'm right, over 10 years. And they looked at the difference in their financial success at the end. And those that had seriously invested into culture, whatever that means, and to whatever extent, but seriously invested in that area, they had, I think, close to 800% higher bottom line. And I find so motivating. So you have a chance of combining what is good for people and yourself. You're also a person, and for the business. And that I love that. You don't have to do it all of the bottom of good of your heart, but you can also make the company better. And I think that's a wonderful combination.
What's one time where you had to learn some of that the hard way? Like, I know you've already given a few examples and war stories, if you will, but
Yeah.
what's one example from when you believed that culture was soft and had little bearing on the bottom line?
Yeah. Let me think. That there are a couple of examples that I'm thinking of now. Let's pick communication, I think, again. So again, I'm a slow learner, and I make the same mistake twice or three times before I really get it. In this case too, I had a couple of difficult one-on-ones with employees in the past. Just two or three, not too many, but always the problem was that I was entering the conversation thinking I knew all about the situation. And that's bad enough. I think people quickly understand that, but it's so hard to understand what you're doing there, that this is a mistake, because you're convinced you know what was happening. And we're talking, of course, about a problem, about a mistake. And not only did I think I knew the situation, I also thought I knew the intention behind that situation. So I thought that that person or that person did it because, I know, fill in the blanks. They are lazy, or they just didn't care, or they forgot again. But again and again, I learned that I was wrong, that there was a different reason for those things. Doesn't mean that the problem must have happened. There would be other solutions to that. That's still the situation is still the same. But rushing to conclusions, rushing or assuming intention, I've made that mistake so many times. And getting back to the bottom line, sometimes you destroy relationships with key employees.
Yeah.
And that is the most serious implication on your bottom line that you can have. I was always able to repair those situations, sometimes by plainly apologizing, sometimes by finding a way and seeing how we both contributed to the problem. But it's always the same, actually. And It's so tricky. It's incredibly tricky. And I don't say I have it all figured out, no way, but I'm starting to get better at it.
Yeah, I mean, 1% better each day. That's all we
Yeah.
can. That's all we can do at the end of the day.
Mhm.
Um, you you also have mentioned to me how hard things were to trust the team, right? Not just the side of, you got to do that before you can get the most out of them, but also just how hard it was as an entrepreneur to really adopt the philosophy of trusting the team from doing it all
Mhm.
yourself or with founders to co-founders to then, trusting that the team will take care of things.
Mhm.
Um, Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, yeah. I think it goes back to if you're a founder or a leader or a manager, I think you're incredibly motivated to get the best out of a situation, to do the best for your company. And of course, you are a smart person
Mm-hmm.
in most cases, and you think you know how it should be done, right? And I think that's the first little problem, because thinking you know how it should be done is a recipe for micromanagement,
Mm,
and that's the opposite of trust, so if you
yes.
will. I think realizing that is the first, I don't know, antidote is a little bit too much, but the first step in the right direction to understand that, or let me say it a different way. Bringing humility into the equation, I think. Understanding, and seriously understanding, that you don't know everything, and you're not always the smartest person in the room. If that were the case, again, you would have hired horribly. If for every topic you would be the smartest person in the room, then that's a problem. And once you realize that, hey, I have capable, nice, and clever colleagues, then I can let go, because they are capable and clever colleagues. So I can trust and see what happens. And I think it's a learning process for both sides. Many people are not used to working in that way. They're not used to not being micromanaged. Some people have different experiences, and God bless, but a lot of people come out of a situation where they were micromanaged, and they're still smart. They're still capable people, but it takes some time to get used to that and to really trust that you're given, right? So it really takes some time, some getting used to, understanding on the leadership side that there is a lot of potential, there's a lot of brains in the room, and you are not always the best person to give the answers. And and not only does that produce better results, but it takes the pressure off of you. It takes so much pressure off of you, because you can let go and say, well, okay, you're the expert on this topic. What do you think?
Mm.
Okay, let's see if that's your opinion. Let's try it like that. And more often than not, you will be surprised and think, well, that's a good outcome that came out of it.
Yeah. Well said. Well said.
Thanks.
The there was this one comment that you made to me. Let me see if I could think of it. Connected to remote work.
Mhm.
Remote work is a combustion agent.
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. What does that mean?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Thanks for remembering that. Yeah. So when I sold my last company, a couple of entrepreneur friends came to me and said, "Well, you've worked extensively with company culture. Can you help us?" And there were others that said, "Well, I know you've worked remotely for 11 years. Can you help us build remote culture? Because I think this whole remote thing doesn't work for us." Okay,
Mm.
so let's take a look. And in all of the cases, we found out, you don't have a remote problem, you have a culture problem. And that goes back to that expression that you kindly reminded me of, combustion agent. Remote just acts as a combustion agent for the other problems that you have in your culture and that are unsolved. It makes them more obvious. And in that perspective, I think I see remote work as a gift, because it points the finger at the problems that you have, and you get a chance to really solve them, to take time and solve them.
Yeah.
Many companies that don't work in a remote setting, they get by with not really working on their culture. Something comes up if you have a shared kitchen, and if you share lunches and the occasional after work beer, some kind of culture comes up. But is it the culture you want to have? I don't think so. So remote work really forces you to get much more intentional about culture, and I like that phrasing. It forces you to build culture. And I think that's really I like that phrasing, because it makes clear that you can do that. You can actively shape culture. It's not something mystical, mysterious that I don't know how it happens. You can really work on that. It takes a lot of work, of course. That's true. But I'm so happy. If we hadn't made the switch to remote work at one point, I am so sure that our culture wouldn't have been nearly as good as it was being a remote team. We had a better culture being a remote team than we had as a co-located team, hands down.
Funny how that works.
Mm-hmm.
I love that term, combustion agent, in the sense of remote work, because it does force you to get intentional. It does force you to make sure that you're, putting culture at the forefront of strategy, right?
Yeah.
So that's terrific. You've given so much already to our audience, Tobias, but I got one more quick hit list for you. I know you've listened to some of our episodes in the past, but we go through this Founder 5 towards the end of every episode. 5 quick hit questions to chat through. So the first one is the number one metric or KPI that you're relentlessly focused on.
Yeah, I think it's relationships, actually. And some people would raise their brows, is this a KPI? And it's hard to measure, of course, definitely. But if we go back in our conversation, I think it became clear that relationships have a huge impact on the bottom line, on how long people stay in the company, on what they're willing to deliver, and their commitment. So keeping relationships and the quality and the number of relationships in a team top of mind, I think is a great KPI.
That's great. The top tip for growth stage founders like yourself.
I think, also going back to early in the conversation, taking time to make personal growth intentional, or not in personal growth is such a wide field, but really self-reflecting, getting to know yourself a little bit better, your quirks and your strength and your weaknesses, and the I mean, it's about shaping your life, right? Entrepreneurship is so much freedom, but you can also have the blinders on for 10 years, and then wake up and see, oh, damn, was this where I wanted to go? And I would hope that everybody avoids that. Self-reflection.
Yeah, a lot of lessons learned there.
Mm-hmm.
A favorite book or podcast, or really whatever medium you choose, that's helped you grow as a founder.
Yeah, I remember reading back in the day, Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux, which is, I think, is a classic by now. It's on the one hand, it's one of those books that don't teach you how to do it, but they whet your appetite for changing things and for shaping culture in such a way that you really get nervous and restless after you've put down the book. And I think that's the kind of energy you need to get started. So Reinventing Organizations is a great read.
That is a great read.
Yeah.
And well said on it doesn't tell you how to do it, but it does give you a lot of really great things to think about, because both types of books are necessary, right?
Yeah.
So that's incredibly important. Okay, here's a fun one. So what actor would play you in a movie?
Yeah, I have to giggle at this one. Those few people that listen to our conversation on YouTube and in video, some people told me I have a resemblance to Christian Bale, which I'm very flattered to hear. I don't see it, but why you asked me who would play me, so I'll pick Christian Bale. Why not?
I love it. Batman.
Yeah.
All right. And finally, when all is said and done, what is going to be the title of your autobiography?
Yeah, I'll pick something aspiring that I have to live up to. I would want that book to be titled the Human Founder or the Human Entrepreneur, if you will. I think that has a lot of room to grow for myself, but also the aspiration that I want to go towards. Yeah.
I love that, Tobias.
Oh.
That's great. You've given so much to our listeners today, and at this time, I just want to allow for any bit of self promotion that those listening can give back to you, because I'm sure they are eager to do so after all of your great thoughts so far. So, how can those listening help you out?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. That's so kind. At the moment, I think the best way is, I don't know, to get in touch with me, maybe to, if you're interested, to follow my work and my thoughts, because I'm trying hard to, yeah, to talk about that human side of business, whatever we understand by that. But I think there's a shortage of that in the in air quotes market. So www.tobias.co Tobias.co is my personal website that links to my Twitter, which isn't too noisy at the moment. LinkedIn is a better place for me, but all of the links are there. And there, I think I have two free guides there, one about remote work and one about culture, actually, both free. So that might be a good way to get started. After you've read Reinventing Organizations, you want to know how to do it, and that could be the first step. I don't know. Yeah.
Love it. Step 1, read Reinventing Organizations. Step 2, get with Tobias. All right. Well,
Perfect.
Tobias, just closing us off here. What's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
I think again, Tobias.co has all the necessary links,
Okay.
and probably LinkedIn is a good place. DMs are open. You say that on Twitter, but it's true for LinkedIn also. So I would really, and I think everybody says that, but I really appreciate if people get in touch and strike up a conversation about these topics. So don't be shy. Email me t@tobias.co, or go on the website and go over LinkedIn, and I'm happy to get in touch and to have a conversation.
Perfect. This has been an absolute pleasure, as always, Tobias, and thanks for joining me on the dirt.
Thank you for having me, Jim. Thanks.
Absolutely. Take care.